Last thing on the news front is some great reporting from John Nash and Anton Tabuena from BloodyElbow.com, and they have been able to secure some of the newer UFC contracts and have been going into some of the language and the changes the UFC has made. So just going back in 2014, a group of fighters, including Kung Lee and Nate Quarry and others, were involved in this class action lawsuit that is still ongoing as we are 8+ years removed from this suit being launched. But essentially, it's a class action lawsuit that included fighters that competed for the UFC anytime from June 30th, 2017 and prior. A second class action lawsuit was filed to cover fighters from July 1st of 2017 onward. So that's sort of your fork in the road of where you would fit for these for this class action lawsuit. Now, the UFC, they have made some changes over the years to their contracts to make them less restrictive. In the past, you could sign a contract way, and if you win my heavyweight title, I could just continually roll over your contract, and that's what the champions clause is. As long as you are champion, it rolls over, so I'm not going to be left with you holding my title and your contract's up, and you can go to to Bellator or somewhere as my champion.
Does that come with an increase in pay?
It's all at the discretion. Like, you sign, and some fighters, they will date, hey, I'm fighting for a title, I want to renegotiate my deal. It's at the discretion of the promotion, but a lot of times they will renegotiate deals midway through, but it's not a guarantee either.
But the champions clause essentially prevents you from the UFC would get first. I mean, even if they don't successfully renegotiate, you still have to compete for the UFC?
There's still yes, you have that, and they just roll over your contract. Further to that is that if you have a 3-year contract with us, Way, and I offer you a fight and you're hurt, you don't want to fight on that day, whatever reason, you turn down the fight, you can extend their contract by like 6 months. Like, it's
like the WWE's.
I would say they're more restrictive than the WWE's. I mean, the WWE has that weird deal where, you get hurt and suddenly that period is frozen, which it baffles me that can stand up, but no one's ever truly challenged that either, and it just is accepted. Anyway, so the UFC, in the past couple of years, they introduced a sunset clause to make these deals less restrictive, and that meant that there was an end date to your contract. Like, if you might sign for 6 fights or 3 years, whichever comes first. And that's how Francis Ngannou got out of his UFC contract. He had an end date in December that, even though he was UFC heavyweight champion, the sunset clause allowed him to reach the end of his contract, and he is now free to go wherever he wants. So that has been a positive when it comes to UFC contracts. But in this new language, there used to be a limit to, if you turn down a fight and we can roll over the contract, it would max out at 18 months. We can't roll it over beyond that. The new language, that's been taken out and would infer that they can just continue to roll these contracts over. In addition to what they have found out is that by you signing these new contracts, you cannot take the UFC to court. You cannot sue them, and you cannot participate in a class action lawsuit. If you have a discrepancy with the promotion, they have to go to arbitration. They will have an arbitrator that will see your case, but that is done all in private. It is not like the public will not know what the ruling is. It will all be done behind closed doors, nor will other fighters be aware of what the outcome is. So if like some landmark is made by the UFC, it's not like it's precedent for all the other fighters to follow through. It's being done much more in secret as well. So again, the UFC is in such a situation, and it is very similar, as Way mentions, to the WWE, that part of the attractiveness of these companies that your Endeavors or others find them so attractive as buys is because you do not have to share anywhere near the revenue that you would have to as any other sports leagues that have unions or associations do. And you generally have a labor force that is, they have no union, they have no association you have to deal with. You don't have to split revenue to the same degree. You don't have to share any of the television revenue. And that's the situation that a lot of these fighters and wrestlers are in. Like, some of them are very well compensated, but these deals are so structured towards the promotion. And this is just the latest indication of that. And as well, noting the fact that we had just talked about kind of the state of Bloody Elbow, and this is the kind of reporting that they do. This is very important stuff to have out there for your public to be aware of what the language is out there. I'm sure a lot of fighters that are finding out about this that have not signed new deals or are under the impression of what the deals used to consist of. So anyway, that is the latest.
You had mentioned on a show that you were on with Brandon recently about you reading a book about the NHLPA's formation.
Yeah,
right,
I just
John?
finished it. Yes, it's called Net Worth.
So, I mean, I'm very curious, how does a union even form for something like a sports league?
Well, we should probably do a future show on it with somebody that can really break down. But, one of the first steps that was trying to be taken was through Leslie Smith, who started this thing called Project Spearhead a few years ago. And that was simply getting fighters to anonymously sign up to get the amount of numbers that they could get it going to try and form an association. Anonymously sign up. They could not even get the numbers for that. Like, the fighters didn't even want to anonymously attach their names because there's so much paranoia that if my name gets attached to an association or union movement, that I could be blackballed. And some of that paranoia is realized because Leslie Smith, who won 3 fights in a row, doesn't get her deal renewed by the UFC. Like, for what other reason than here is someone that is trying to rock the boat. She's won 3 fights in a row, and we're not going to offer her a new contract. That's a pretty loud statement about anyone that, we do not want to deal with these headaches. And these fighters, they're looking at, I can understand it. It's like, I've got a few years to potentially make some money. I am not going to spend it fighting the UFC. Randy Couture spent $500,000 in legal fees for sitting out a year trying to get out of his UFC contract, and then had to come back and fought Brock Lesnar. And that was 15 years ago. So, you see, and when Francis
15
Ngannou,
years ago, wow.
Yeah, when Francis Ngannou was doing his negotiations, he was told by the UFC, go ask Randy how this turns out. Like, they know that we can flex our muscle, and Francis Ngannou is now free, but he is now, he is going to have to go and make negotiate on his behalf and make these big boxing fights and such. But in MMA, if this guy wants to make these millions and millions of dollars, there's kind of only one avenue to do so.
It sounds so incredibly bleak, like we're talking about the Star Wars versus the Empire or something, man. Like, it's
this hockey book that I just wrote, man, read was eye-opening. Just where hockey players were at a time where, dude, they couldn't even see their contracts. They weren't even allowed to see their contracts, and it was just so much
changed. So what was the how did they actually get the NHLPA created?
I mean, it was formed, and then it was kind of like dissolved, and it was like Alan Eagleson, who was one of the people that like spearheaded an association to get all of these players together. But then with Alan Eagleson, I mean, you can do your history on Alan Eagleson. This was someone that ended up being accused and going to jail because he was accused of like stealing from the players and misappropriating funds from their pension. And here was somebody that was supposed to be their big advocate and ended up being pretty much excommunicated from the Players Association. But it took, there were a lot of, they talked about just the overall culture that was instilled in these hockey players, that you play for the love of the game and you don't affect the NHL because you asking for too much money, it could kill us. And they hid all these profits from the players and were essentially stating we're not getting rich off of this. You should be happy just to play. And it turned out they were making plenty of money, but they didn't have to be transparent about what they were making. And it was only once, various agents got involved and the players suddenly realized that they were being left out of this. But you had a lot of players that just were not going to, they were just not brought up in that sort of combative state to, demand their fair shake. And it took years and years for them to have the proper representation that would get them anywhere near to where the NBA and Major League Baseball was in comparison. They were well behind in advancements for labor causes. And pro wrestling and MMA is like almost at the starting block when you're looking at it. Like the idea of these, billion-dollar rights deals that we talk about, and these talents, these fighters, they have no ability to share from it. When, Dwayne Johnson's Under Armour deal with the UFC is made, none of that trickles down. The Crypto.com sponsorships, none of that trickles down. Like all these sponsorships you see, the fighters don't have any percentage of that goes down to them. And they have been told, hey, you can no longer get outside sponsors. You only have sponsors we approve of, and you got to wear your uniforms. And then you've got all these logos throughout the octagon that just flood your screen, and that's all promotional revenue that comes in.
All right. And what's the name of that book again?
Net Worth. It came out in the early 90s, but you can look it up on Amazon. It's a really interesting book where like you could draw a lot of comparisons to like modern day where some of these sports are that we cover.